There are few betrayals more cruel than the one that follows loss when the heart is too broken to defend itself, and the ones you expect to offer comfort instead deliver humiliation. And this is the story of Sharon, a young mother not just grieving the sudden loss of her husband Michael, but forced to endure something most people wouldn't believe unless they saw it for themselves. It happened on the day of his funeral, a rain-soaked afternoon where guests arrived in black ties and solemn faces. But behind their respectful gazes, a storm was already brewing. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of Michael's wealthy and controlling family. And when Sharon arrived holding her baby, her eyes red from crying and her voice soft from sleepless nights, she had no idea what was coming. Because who expects to be kicked out of a funeral for loving someone too purely for marrying someone the family deemed beneath their name? And yet, as she stepped toward the front pew, Margaret, Michael's mother, with a voice colder than marble, leaned in and told her, "You don't belong here. Not unless you sign this." And she was handed a legal document, a waiver disowning her right to Michael's estate, to his home, to any claim, to the name she had carried with pride. And when Sharon refused, not with a scream, but with a trembling whisper, "I just want to say goodbye," Margaret nodded to her eldest son, Daniel, who took Sharon by the arm and escorted her out while guests pretended not to see. And Sharon, in her grief, in her disbelief, clutched her baby and stood alone on the church steps, soaked to the bone, and still whispering goodbye. And this moment is more than fiction. It mirrors what many widows around the world face when inheritance becomes a battlefield and love becomes a legal technicality. Stories from India, Nigeria, even the United States show how women are stripped of property, denied access to assets, or pressured into silence, all while navigating loss. Sharon's story could have ended there, forgotten by the world, if not for a man who stepped out of a shadow, not with flash or fury, but with a simple umbrella. His name was Tyler Rivera, and Sharon didn't recognize him at first until he spoke softly and said, "Michael asked me to find you if anything ever happened." And those words, those exact words, had been whispered to her by Michael days before his death, and she had almost dismissed them as romantic until this moment. And Tyler held out a letter, not legal, not notarized, just handwritten, signed by Michael. And in it, he explained that years ago, he had saved Tyler's life, and in return asked him to promise that if Sharon was ever alone, Tyler would be her shield. And Sharon could barely read the words through her tears. And Tyler didn't push, didn't explain. He just opened the car door and waited, and she got in. Not because she trusted him yet, but because she had no one else. And as the rain pelted the windows, Tyler drove to a quiet apartment Michael had secretly secured for her in case of family retaliation. It had everything she needed: a crib, stocked with supplies, clean sheets, warm light, and silence, the kind that didn't judge. And Sharon sat on the couch, her baby asleep in her arms, and wept not just from pain, but from relief. And Tyler sat across the room, not speaking, just being present. And this is the kind of man we forget to write about, the one who doesn't arrive with fanfare, but changes everything by showing up. And over the next few days, Tyler brought food and space in equal measure. He didn't ask about Michael or the will or what had happened at the funeral. He simply said, "You're safe, and if you need to talk, I'll be here." And slowly, Sharon began to breathe again, not deeply, but enough to know she hadn't disappeared, and she found small comforts in the apartment. The smell of the baby lotion. Michael used the photo of them he had placed on the mantle with a note on the back that read, "You are my light," and these details told her more than any document could, that she was seen, that she was loved, and that Michael had prepared for this, not out of paranoia, but because he knew his family. And Tyler became her quiet witness, not solving her grief, but making space for it. And in the next part, we'll see how that space allows Sharon to rediscover her voice, how letters from Michael unlock something buried, and how quiet protection can sometimes be louder than any promise shouted from a rooftop. Grief isn't loud. It's not always sobbing or screaming. Sometimes it's silence that lingers like a fog curling around your limbs so tightly that even moving from one room to the next feels like an impossible task. And in the days following the funeral, Sharon lived in that fog, wrapped in it, nursing her child with shaking hands, drinking tea that went cold on the table, and staring out the window of the safe apartment, as if searching for the version of her life that had existed before the funeral, before the betrayal, before her world had been redrawn in grief and silence. and Tyler remained a constant, not hovering, not speaking, unless she did simply existing in the space, like a lighthouse, calm and steady. And it was this steady presence, not dramatic interventions, that gave Sharon her first moments of peace. Because in trauma recovery, one of the most crucial elements is consistency. Studies show that survivors don't heal through catharsis alone, but through the slow rebuilding of trust with those who ask nothing in return, and Tyler embodied that. And one afternoon, while looking for a clean onesie for her baby Sharon, opened a drawer she hadn't touched before and found a box inside a small wooden chest with her name carved on the lid. And inside that box were letters from Michael written in his handwriting, folded carefully and sealed with dates marked across each envelope. And she sat down on the floor. Her breath caught in her throat and began to read the first one. And it started with, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted. And I'm so sorry." And what followed was a cascade of memories and love and apologies, and most of all, reminders. Michael telling her she was stronger than she believed, that she had already survived more than most people would ever know, and that he had always known his family might try to erase her. That's why he had put things in place, had trusted Tyler, had written everything down, had made sure that someone would be there. And Sharon cried not quietly but openly, the kind of cry that feels like letting go, like breathing again after drowning. And Tyler walked in, saw her holding the letter, and said softly, "I didn't read them. He wanted them to be just yours." And Sharon nodded because she knew he was telling the truth. And over the next few days, she read them all, one each morning, like a ritual. And each one gave her back a piece of herself, a memory, a laugh, a truth she had forgotten. And one letter included a list of things Michael loved about her, written in bullet points, from the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous to the way she always kissed their son's forehead, twice before bed. And Sharon began to smile again. Not all at once, but in pieces, and she started cooking again. Small meals, nothing fancy, but enough to feel capable. And one day she found a picture frame with an old photo of her and Michael, and she placed it on the table next to her tea, and Tyler quietly cleaned the glass when she wasn't looking, later saying it should look loved. And that detail more than anything stayed with her, because people often think healing requires grand gestures, but sometimes it's wiping the dust off a memory so it can shine again. And Sharon began to speak more often, asking Tyler questions about Michael, stories from college jokes she'd never heard before. And Tyler shared them all, but never inserted himself, never made it about him. And one evening, while holding her baby, Sharon asked, "Why did Michael trust you with us?" And Tyler said, "Because I owed him my life." And when she looked confused, he explained that years ago during a winter trip, Michael had pulled him from a frozen river during a hiking accident, nearly losing his own life in the process. And afterward, Tyler had told him, "If you ever need me, I'm yours." And Michael had simply said, "Promise me you'll take care of them." And that's all Tyler needed. And this kind of loyalty isn't fiction. It exists in stories of veterans who care for fallen comrades' families, or survivors who pay forward the help they once received. And it proves that love can echo beyond death, not just through blood, but through commitment. And Sharon now found herself wondering what she would do with this gift, this peace, this chance to start again. And that question would soon find its answer, not in comfort, but in confrontation. Because Michael's family was not done, and the next part will explore how they returned to try to take what was never theirs, and how Sharon, instead of collapsing, would stand and speak for herself for the first time with a clarity they never expected. Some wars are not fought with weapons or anger, but with truth. And in the days leading up to the court hearing, Sharon didn't sleep much. Not because she was afraid, but because she was preparing not for a fight, but for a testimony of love and loss and truth. And Tyler, who had remained calm and steady for weeks now, became her advocate in full. Not just the quiet presence in the room, but the voice in the courtroom, who would speak the words she had lived. And it began with a letter, a formal notice from Margaret and Daniel seeking custody of Sharon's child, claiming she was unstable, grieving, unfit. And this tactic, though cruel, is not uncommon across legal systems, where grieving widows without financial leverage are painted as fragile or incapable. And Sharon wanted to scream, but instead she gathered her journals, her photos, her letters, and her memories, and gave them all to Tyler. And what he crafted was not a defense built on legal jargon, but a story of real motherhood, of late nights, of lullabies, of folded onesies and whispered prayers. And when the day came, Sharon walked into the courtroom, not in black, not in shame, but in blue. The color Michael always said made her look like the sky after rain, and she held her baby close and stood tall. And the courtroom quieted as Tyler spoke because he didn't attack. He invited the room into their world. He described a woman who had been dragged from her husband's funeral, but chose grace instead of vengeance, who had raised her child in silence and strength. And then he opened the photo album page by page, showing the judge pictures of Sharon and her baby, laughing, reading, walking under trees, smiling in ways that could not be faked. When Margaret's lawyer objected and called it emotional manipulation, Tyler calmly said, "Isn't parenthood emotional?" And the judge didn't speak but leaned in, and the turning point came when Sharon stood, her voice steady as she said, "I am not broken, I am not ashamed, and my child knows nothing but love, and that is more than his family ever showed me." And then she handed the judge one final letter from Michael, written just days before his death, where he wrote, "If anything happens, I trust Sharon to raise our child with more love than I was ever shown, and I trust Tyler to protect them if my family forgets what love means." And that letter changed everything, because it wasn't just legal, it was personal. And even the judge seemed moved, and after a pause that felt like a year, the ruling was read: full custody to Sharon. No visitation rights granted pending psychological evaluation of the petitioners, and Margaret for the first time looked small, not because she had lost, but because she had been seen for who she really was. And Daniel said nothing and left without a word. And as Sharon walked out of the courtroom, the weight lifted, not with celebration, but with quiet relief. And Tyler waited by the car and said, "You did that?" Not me. And Sharon smiled and replied, "No, we did." And that's what healing often looks like. Not a triumphant ending, but a soft exhale and a path forward. And in the days that followed, Sharon received a small package in the mail. No note, just a folded cloth, and she recognized it immediately. It was the handkerchief she had used to wipe Michael's forehead in the hospital the last time she saw him, and it had been washed, folded, and returned. And though she would never know if Margaret sent it, she chose to believe it was her way of apologizing. And sometimes closure doesn't come through apology, but through choosing to forgive anyway. And that moment became the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And Sharon no longer walked through the apartment with grief clinging to her. Like fog, she now walked with her head high, her baby on her hip, and a vision forming in her heart for something bigger. And in the next part, we'll see how she and Tyler take their pain and build a future not just for themselves, but for others who need the same kind of quiet rescue. And how love, when rooted in purpose, can light the way forward for those still trapped in the dark. Grief may have been what brought them together, but purpose is what carried them forward. And in the months after the custody ruling, Sharon didn't retreat into peace. She leaned into something deeper, a calling to make sure no woman ever had to stand where she once did, alone on the church steps, grieving while being erased. And it started with the name Michael's Light, and it became more than just a foundation. It became a promise, a community resource center for single mothers, widows, women in crisis, offering not just shelter or advice, but dignity. Tyler helped with the legal setup, but insisted Sharon be the face, the heart, the one who knew what it felt like to be broken and still show up for others. And Sharon didn't want fanfare. She wanted a place where people knocked on the door and found the lights already on. And that's what they built: a space with warmth, with color, with donated books and handmade quilts, with coffee always brewing and someone always listening. And one wall was covered in framed letters, each from a woman they had helped, and next to it a small plaque that read, "Your story isn't over just because someone walked away." Every time Sharon saw a new woman arrive, eyes guarded, voice low, she welcomed her like family, because she remembered, and healing didn't stop there. It rippled. Tyler continued his quiet work in the background, balancing casework with his presence. And Michael's son, now a toddler, called him Ty. Not dad, not yet, but the name didn't matter. What mattered was that every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every walk in the park had his fingerprints all over it. And Sharon never asked for a proposal, and Tyler never gave one. Not out of fear, but because their commitment was never about ceremony. It was about consistency. And when people asked what they were to each other, Sharon would just smile and say, "We're good." And that was enough. And one spring day, they held a picnic for the families they had helped. And Sharon stood under a tree reading a letter Michael had written for his son. And when she finished, she said to the group, "He never got to see who you've become, but you are his legacy." And the toddler ran up and hugged her, and Tyler joined her under the tree, and they stood holding hands, not for the cameras, but because it had become instinct. And in the real world, stories like this do happen, from community-led sanctuaries for abuse survivors to widows who use their inheritance to create grant programs for other women in crisis. And while the news rarely covers quiet triumphs, they matter deeply, and Michael's Light became a local story that spread statewide, a place people knew by name, not because of tragedy, but because of what had risen from it. And every year on the anniversary of Michael's death, Sharon and Tyler took the day off. No speeches, no meetings. Just a walk through the park with their son, a moment of silence by the bench with his name on it, and then ice cream because Michael loved vanilla bean. And Sharon would always say he deserved a little sweetness. And their love was never built on erasing the past. It was built on honoring it quietly without guilt and with deep gratitude, and that is what made it last, not a fairy tale, but a real thing rooted in grief, grown in presence and watered with time. And if you're watching this, wondering if your pain has purpose, if your story can still bloom, remember this: love doesn't always knock. It sometimes waits quietly outside until you open the door. And when you do, it doesn't demand, it simply says, "I'm here and I'm not leaving." And that is what Michael gave Sharon, and what Tyler carried forward, and what Sharon now gives to everyone who finds their way to that little brick building with the lights always on and the coffee always warm and the sign on the wall that reads, "Come in, you are seen."